Detective David Hart had spent 30 years in the homicide division of a large metropolitan police department. His desk was clean, his coffee was cold, and his retirement papers sat folded in his jacket pocket. He was 3 days away from turning in his badge. The department had already planned a small ceremony, the kind that felt more like a polite dismissal than a celebration. David welcomed it. He had seen too much violence, too many lies, and too many cases that never truly closed. On a gray Tuesday morning, just as he was about to clear his locker, a new case landed on his desk. A man in his 40s had been found dead in an alley behind a shuttered restaurant. Initial reports suggested a robbery gone wrong. The victim's wallet was missing, and he had been struck twice in the head with a blunt object. But the crime scene photos showed something that bothered David. The victim's hands were clean, his posture too composed. This was not a random mugging. Security footage from a nearby bank revealed a crucial detail. 15 minutes before his death, the victim met a hooded figure and handed over a yellow envelope. The victim then walked toward the alley. The hooded figure disappeared in the opposite direction. David pulled the victim's file. His name was Kevin Marks, a desk sergeant with 15 years on the force. The case was no longer a simple robbery. It was now a homicide involving a police officer, and the pressure from upstairs was immediate. David was told to close it fast and call it a mugging. He did the opposite. The hooded figure from the footage was identified through a combination of traffic cameras and witness statements. A local civil rights attorney named Matthew Ellis. Ellis had no criminal record, but he had built a reputation for suing the police department over excessive force and wrongful convictions. Many officers considered him a public enemy. David had met him once, years earlier, in a deposition room. He remembered Ellis as calm, precise, and unsettlingly well prepared. Now Ellis was being brought in for questioning, though there was no direct evidence linking him to the murder, only the handoff of the envelope. David chose to handle the interrogation himself. He sat in the observation room first, watching Ellis through the one-way glass. The attorney did not look nervous. He sat with his hands folded, occasionally glancing at the mirror as if he knew exactly who was watching. When David finally entered, he placed a file on the table and sat across from Ellis. He explained the situation: a dead officer, an envelope, a connection to Ellis. He asked for an explanation. Ellis smiled slightly and asked for a cup of coffee. Then he made an offer: 10 minutes of uninterrupted truth, no recording, no notes, in exchange for the coffee and a guarantee that he would not be charged with obstruction. David knew this was irregular, but his instincts told him to listen. He turned off the recording camera, sent the uniformed officer out, and poured 2 cups from the station thermos. Ellis took a slow sip and began to speak. Matthew Ellis explained that the dead officer, Kevin Marks, had been running a side business for nearly a decade. For cash, Marks would fabricate evidence to secure convictions, planting drugs, falsifying reports, even coaching witnesses. He operated with the protection of higher-ups who benefited from high arrest numbers and closed cases. Ellis had gathered evidence of this corruption over 2 years, working with a small group of whistleblowers inside the department. The yellow envelope contained a key to a locker at a private storage facility on the outskirts of the city. Inside that locker were digital files, financial records, and signed affidavits from 3 officers willing to testify. Marks had agreed to hand over the key in exchange for immunity and a payment to leave the country. But someone found out. Before Marks could disappear, he was killed. Ellis said he never touched Marks, he only received the envelope and left. He had been waiting for the right moment to bring the evidence to the district attorney, but now, with Marks dead, he feared the locker would be discovered and destroyed by whoever ordered the murder. David listened without interrupting. He had worked with some of the officers Ellis named. One of them was his own partner of 12 years, Detective Raymond Cross. Another was the current chief of police, Arthur Hill. David felt the weight of the information settle into his chest. He asked Ellis why he was telling him this. Ellis replied that David was known as the one honest detective in the division, the one who never played the game. And now, Ellis said, David had to choose, retire in 3 days with a clean pension, or open the locker and tear down everything he had once protected. David left the interrogation room without making a decision. He told the desk sergeant to hold Ellis on a minor charge, loitering near a crime scene, to buy himself time. Then he drove to the storage facility listed on the keys tag. The place was a maze of rust-colored doors under flickering fluorescent lights. He found locker 147, inserted the key, and pulled up the door. Inside were 3 cardboard boxes and a laptop. He sat on the concrete floor and began to go through the contents. There were photocopies of arrest reports with altered timelines, bank deposit slips matching cash amounts to specific cases, and audio recordings of phone calls between Sergeant Marks and a captain discussing which officers needed their numbers boosted. The most damning was a handwritten ledger listing payoffs with initials instead of names. David recognized several sets of initials, RC for Raymond Cross, AH for Arthur Hill. There were also names of prosecutors who had looked the other way. David took photos of everything with his phone, then locked the locker and drove home in silence. That night he did not sleep. He thought about the cases he had worked alongside Cross, the confessions they had obtained, the convictions they had celebrated. He wondered how many of those were built on lies. By dawn, he had made a decision. He would not retire quietly. He would find out who killed Kevin Marks and let the truth fall where it may. But first, he needed to know if Cross was involved in the murder itself, or only in the cover-up that followed. The next morning, David arrived at the precinct earlier than usual. He found Raymond Cross at his desk, reading a report with a cup of coffee in hand. Cross was a large man with a friendly face, the kind of partner who remembered birthdays and told terrible jokes. For 12 years they had trusted each other with their lives. David sat across from him and asked what he knew about Kevin Marks. Cross's expression shifted, a brief flicker of caution before the mask returned. He said Marks was a desk sergeant, nothing special, probably got caught up in something stupid. David mentioned the envelope and the storage locker. Cross set down his coffee and leaned forward. He asked why David was digging into a case that was supposed to be a routine mugging. David replied that routine mugging victims don't hand over evidence keys to civil rights attorneys. Cross was quiet for a moment, then said something that chilled David. He said that Chief Hill had already classified the Marks homicide as a closed case, pending review. The official finding would be death by misadventure during a drug deal. There would be no further investigation. Cross advised David to let it go, to enjoy his retirement, and to stop talking to Matthew Ellis. When David asked if Cross had known about Marks's side business, Cross stood up and said the conversation was over. He walked out of the bullpen without looking back. David sat alone at his desk, the weight of the locker's contents heavy in his jacket pocket. He now knew two things: Cross was complicit, and someone was moving fast to bury everything. David decided to go around official channels. He contacted an old acquaintance in the district attorney's office, a prosecutor named Linda Chen who had a reputation for independence. They met at a diner far from the courthouse. David showed her the photos he had taken from the locker. Chen studied them for a long time, her expression unreadable. She asked if David understood what he was holding. This was not just a few dirty cops, it was a network that had influenced dozens of cases over many years. If the evidence was authentic, it would trigger federal investigations, civil lawsuits, and the overturning of multiple convictions. It would also make enemies of everyone named in the files. Shen said she would need the original materials to move forward, but she warned David that once she filed a motion, there would be no going back. David told her he was ready. They agreed to meet again in 48 hours, at which point David would hand over the locker key. As David left the diner, he noticed a dark sedan parked across the street with two men inside. He did not recognize them, but they watched him until he drove away. He took a long route back to the city, checking his rearview mirror constantly. The sedan did not follow, but the message was clear: someone was aware of his movements. That evening, he moved the contents of the locker to a secure location, a safe deposit box at a bank in a neighboring county, registered under a name he had not used in years. The following morning, David received an unexpected summons to Chief Arthur Hill's office. Hill was a polished administrator who had risen through the ranks by cultivating loyalty and avoiding scandal. His office was decorated with commendations and photos of him shaking hands with mayors. David had never been close to Hill, but he had always respected the chain of command. Now he sat across from the chief's mahogany desk and waited. Hill began with pleasantries, congratulations on retirement, appreciation for years of service. Then his tone shifted. He said he had heard that David was spending time with Matthew Ellis, a known adversary of the department, and that he was asking questions about a closed case. Hill advised David that his legacy should not be tarnished by conspiracy theories. He mentioned David's pension, his healthcare benefits, and the importance of leaving with dignity. David asked if Hill knew what Marks had been doing for 15 years. Hill's expression hardened. He said Marks was a troubled officer who made poor choices, and the department had already taken steps to address the matter internally. David asked if those steps included the destruction of evidence. Hill stood up, signaling the meeting was over. He told David to turn in his badge by the end of the week and to stay away from the Marks case. David left the office with his heart pounding. He now had confirmation that Hill was directly involved in the cover-up. He also knew that the 48-hour window he had given himself was now a race against a system that wanted him silent. David spent the next 24 hours working in the shadows. He used his credentials to access personnel files, cross-referencing the initials in the ledger with officers who had worked under Captain Marks. He found patterns: officers who had been promoted despite poor performance records, units that had unusually high arrest rates for minor drug offenses, and a steady flow of asset forfeiture money that was never properly accounted for. The deeper he dug, the more he realized that the corruption was not a few bad apples but a coordinated operation that had been running for years. He also found evidence that Sergeant Kevin Marks had tried to back out of the deal with Ellis at the last minute. According to phone records obtained from a subpoena that Linda Chen had quietly filed, Marks had called a number registered to Chief Hill's personal line 2 hours before his death. The call lasted 4 minutes. After that call, Marks left his apartment, retrieved the envelope, and met Ellis. Within an hour, Marks was dead. David pieced together the most likely scenario. Marks had panicked and tried to warn Hill, offering to return the evidence in exchange for protection. Hill, instead of negotiating, had sent someone to intercept Marks before he could hand over the key. The murder was not a mugging. It was an execution ordered by the chief of police to protect a system of corruption that extended to the highest levels of the department. David now had a timeline, a motive, and a direct link between the victim and the man who gave the order. But he still lacked one thing: the identity of the person who actually struck the blows. The break came from an unexpected source. A traffic enforcement officer named Teresa Okonkwo approached David in the parking garage. She was young, nervous, and kept looking over her shoulder. She said she had heard David was asking questions about Kevin Marks. She had been working the night of the murder, running license plate scanners near the alley. Her system had flagged a vehicle that was later scrubbed from the log. She had saved a screenshot before the deletion. The vehicle was an unmarked police sedan assigned to the chief's security detail. The officer driving it was a man named Derek Flynn, a former military operative who had been Hill's personal driver for 5 years. Okonkwo said she had kept quiet because she was afraid, but after hearing that David might be exposing the truth, she wanted to do the right thing. David thanked her and took the screenshot. He now had the murderer's identity. That evening, he met Linda Chen at the bank where the safe deposit box was located. They retrieved the original files together. Chen told him she had already drafted an emergency motion for a special prosecutor, bypassing the local district attorney's office entirely. She would file it at 9 a.m. the next day. David spent the night at a motel outside the city, knowing that his own apartment might not be safe. He sent a single text message to Matthew Ellis's lawyer, "Tomorrow. Stay ready." At 8:45 a.m., David drove toward the courthouse. He had not slept, but his mind was clear. He carried a copy of all evidence in a sealed envelope, with instructions that it be delivered to the federal prosecutor's office if anything happened to him. As he approached the courthouse parking lot, he saw 2 patrol cars blocking the entrance. Chief Hill stepped out of one of them, flanked by Derek Flynn and 2 other officers. Hill walked up to David's window and told him to get out of the car. David refused. Hill said that David was under administrative suspension pending an investigation into mishandling of evidence. He demanded David's badge and weapon. David looked past Hill and saw Linda Chen standing at the courthouse steps, her phone raised, recording everything. He had texted her his location minutes earlier. Hill noticed the camera and his composure cracked. He ordered Flynn to take David's keys. Flynn reached for the door handle, and David did something he had not done in decades. He locked the doors and pressed the horn, drawing the attention of pedestrians and courthouse security. Chen ran toward them, shouting that she had a court order protecting David as a witness in a federal inquiry. Hill's face went pale. Security officers moved between the patrol cars and David's vehicle. Flynn stepped back. Chen handed a folded document to Hill and told him that his suspension order was void, and that he was now officially a subject of the investigation. What followed was a cascade of events that unfolded over the next 72 hours. The special prosecutor impaneled a grand jury. Derek Flynn was arrested at his home that afternoon after Chen presented the traffic camera screenshot and David's testimony. Flynn initially refused to speak, but when faced with life sentences for first-degree murder and conspiracy, he made a deal. He testified that Chief Hill had ordered him to retrieve the envelope from Marks by any means necessary. When Marks resisted, Flynn struck him twice with a metal pipe. Hill had personally orchestrated the cover-up, instructing Flynn to dispose of the weapon and altering the patrol logs. Flynn's testimony opened the door for more witnesses. The 3 officers whose affidavits were in the locker came forward publicly. Raymond Cross was arrested 2 days later for perjury and evidence tampering. 6 other officers were suspended pending further charges. Chief Hill resigned hours before the city council was scheduled to vote on his termination. He was indicted for conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and bribery. His arraignment was attended by a crowd of reporters and a small group of citizens who had been wrongfully convicted on evidence now proven false. David watched the news coverage from his living room, the retirement papers still in his jacket pocket, and signed. In the weeks that followed, David became a reluctant public figure. His name appeared in national headlines as the detective who took down his own department. He received letters of thanks from families whose loved ones had been exonerated, as well as anonymous threats from those who still supported the old regime. He did not give interviews. He attended the funerals of no one. Linda Chen was promoted to deputy district attorney and began the long process of reviewing hundreds of cases that had been tainted by the conspiracy. Matthew Ellis filed a civil lawsuit on behalf of the victims, naming the city and the former police chief. The settlement would eventually reach millions of dollars. David's partner, Raymond Cross, pleaded guilty to a reduced charge in exchange for testimony against Hill. Cross was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. David did not visit him. On his last day in the department, he cleaned out his locker, returned his badge to the quartermaster, and walked out through the same back door he had used for 30 years. No one from the command staff was there to see him go. He got into his car, drove to the small house he had bought 20 years earlier, and sat on the porch as the sun went down. The case was closed, but the silence felt heavier than he had expected. 3 months later, David received an unexpected visit from Matthew Ellis. Ellis arrived without an appointment, carrying a manila folder. They sat in David's kitchen, the same 2 cups of coffee between them as in the interrogation room. Ellis thanked him for what he had done, then slid the folder across the table. Inside were the final reports from the special prosecutor's office. All charges against Derek Flynn had been resolved with a guilty plea. Flynn would serve 25 years. Chief Hill's trial was set to begin in the spring, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Ellis said that the city had offered to rename the police academy after David, an honor he immediately declined. Ellis asked if David regretted anything. David thought for a long moment. He said he regretted that it took him 30 years to see what was in front of him. He regretted that Kevin Marks had to die before anyone acted. But he did not regret opening the locker. Ellis nodded, finished his coffee, and left. David spent the rest of the day in his garden, a quiet hobby he had never had time for. That evening, he received a letter from a man whose conviction had been overturned thanks to the evidence David had uncovered. The man wrote that he had spent 12 years in prison for a crime he did not commit, and that David had given him back his life. David folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer where he had once kept his service weapon. He closed the drawer and walked outside. The street was quiet, the lights of the city flickering in the distance. He had no badge, no title, no cases left to solve. But for the first time in decades, he felt something close to peace.